We begin tonight by recognizing and acknowledging that Illinois includes ancestral lands of the Peoria, Picachia, Piankashaw, Way, Miami, Mesquite, Odawa, Sauk, Misaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. We gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples of whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. Hi, I'm Jan Schwartz, Chair of Promote Equity Illinois. We are a coalition of 31 organizations that work together to provide quarterly programs. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's town hall, Systematic Racism in Illinois Public Schools. For decades, systematic racism has generated harmful inequities in our Illinois public school system. Tonight's program has an amazing panel that will discuss the range of issues and policies unfairly impacting our students, educators, and communities, and through many lenses. Our panel will also provide us with guidance on how we can conduct both racism and inequity in the public schools and build a healthier educational system for all students. My friend and colleague, Betty Magnus, one of the co-founders of Promote Equity Illinois, Illinois Political Director of Rainbow Push, will introduce the first of our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Good evening, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm introducing Dr. Sonja Whitaker, the National Education Policy Director for Push for Excellence, which is the education arm of the Rainbow Push Coalition. She is a highly regarded educator whose experience has included serving as superintendent of schools in 2 different school districts. Through all her progressive career, her experience also includes serving as deputy superintendent of schools, and she has now served as director of literacy, principal, a principal, an assistant principal, and a teacher. So that means she's been in worn shoes in every single one of the areas of education we're dealing with tonight. Dr. Whitaker is a published author. Her book is entitled, Is There Anybody That Can Teach Me How to Read? Boy, do we need that book. In April of 2010, Heinemann Educational Publishing Company released Dr. Whitaker's professional development DVD entitled, The Culturally Responsible Teacher, How Understanding Culture Positively Impacts Instruction and Student Achievement. Over the past 2 years, she has significantly impacted public education in the state of Illinois by developing a presentation entitled, What's Race Got to Do with It? Her training in this area have been made available to every educator in the state, and the content aims to raise consciousness around racism and bias in schools and the impact on teaching, learning, and policy development. There is a DVD available that you can find called What's Race Got to Do with It? Now may I present to some and introduce to others my friend, Dr. Sonja Whitaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Magnus, who I respect so much. And I would also like to thank all members of each organization that's responsible for tonight. I'd like to thank our viewing audience for, most importantly, giving of your gift of time. We know there's a lot of other things that you can be doing right now, but you're checked into us for at least the next 90 minutes, and we're grateful for that. I have the great honor of opening up tonight by really just setting the stage for what we have in store for you. I'd like to be clear, like any good teacher, about our objective, our purpose. The purpose of our time this evening will indeed be to engage in conversations around the persistent impact of systemic racism on Illinois schools and districts. And I also want you to know that we're going to keep our focus to 3 different areas in particular. In other words, as opposed to going wide and surface level as it relates for the messages that we have prepared for you tonight, we're going to go very, very narrow so that we can go very, very, very deep. But before I do that, I'd like to start out by sharing with you the motivation behind the work that I do, which will add value to, I think, the speakers that we have and the panelists today. The motivation behind the work that I've been able to do, both locally, at the state level, and nationally, came as a direct result of me serving as a building principal in the northwest suburbs of Illinois. About maybe the 21st day of school, in fact, I happened to be promoted to principal in the same building where I served as assistant principal. So I knew all of the students and I knew the staff. And the reason why that's relevant, because it was a new school year and we were just a few weeks into it. And a teacher called down to the office and she said, Dr. Whitaker, she said, there's a student in my class. He's off task. He's literally kicking and screaming. We just can't function. And this happened to be a teacher who had done an amazing job of managing behavior. And so I knew if this teacher was calling down to the office, she needed help. So she and her peers actually managed to get the student to the office, and I had him sit, and I had informed him that his mother was on the way, that I had processed with her on the phone, and that he needed to remain seated until she arrived. Well, to my surprise, I stepped out to talk with the teacher, and when I came back, the student was standing at the secretary's desk, like he was literally standing on his tippy toes talking with the secretary. And as you can imagine, I was a bit thrown off by that because, as you know, he had already been off task in classroom. And in my humble estimation, he appeared to be off task in the office. What happened next changed me. Like, it changed me forever. At the end of the day, secretary called me over to her desk and she said, Dr. Whitaker, do you want to know what that student asked me? Not just the first time that you left out of your office, but the second time. And I said, why, sure. And she said, what he asked me. She said, he walked over my desk. He looked me square in the eye. And what he asked or said to me is there anybody in this school who can teach me how to read? Is there anybody? And that moment changed me. You see, at that moment, it didn't matter to me that people refer to me as doc. I had an experienced staff. The majority of my staff had master's degrees and beyond. That didn't matter to me. At that moment, in my professional career, as it relates to being on this equity journey, the only thing that mattered to me is that there was a child on my watch who was dying to matter. And as far as I am concerned, he had made up in his mind that he was going to be good at being good, or he was going to be good at being bad, but he was going to be really, really, really good at something. And so that leads me to the three areas that we're going to focus on tonight. You see, that student was emotionally distraught. Not only was I concerned about his academic well-being, but I was concerned about the climate and the culture that had been recreated within our culture, within our organization, that either decreased or increased the likelihood that he felt a sense of belonging. That is an area of focus for us tonight, culture and climate. Another area of focus for us is curriculum. And the third and final area of focus for us tonight is in the area of school funding. Now, with regards to curriculum, please allow me to share with you, setting the stage again for each of these pieces in particular. With regards to curriculum, I'm reminded of the quote by Carter G. Woodson in his book entitled The Miseducation of the Negro. And the quote reads as follows: if you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself with what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. And if you make a man think he is unjustly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if the door is closed, his very nature will demand that you open one. With regards to our focus tonight, particularly as it relates to the curriculum, we're going to delve deep into conversations about who controls the curriculum, because who controls the development and the selection of curriculum actually controls the narrative. And as a direct result of these attempts, far too many teachers unintentionally become a piece of the puzzle that I refer to as a systemic racism as it relates to the selection and or writing of curriculum materials. With regards to climate, in the state of Illinois in particular, all school districts are required to participate in what is referred to as the 5 Essential Survey. We're going to talk about that tonight. But I must admit, with my equity lens on, I can't help but to wonder which population of students in Illinois schools is actually being nurtured. What population of students in Illinois is actually being made to believe that they are intellectually capable of achieving at extremely high levels. I can't help but to imagine what the results of 5 essential surveys would be like if we practice the policy of intentionality as it relates to ensuring that all students find themselves a great place in our institution, referred to as academia. And then lastly, with regard to state funding, it is important to recognize that we are proud in our great state of Illinois that there's been a lot of work done to address the issue of inequities as it relates to state funding of our schools in particular. It's important to recognize that in the year of 2018, in the state of Illinois, we implemented what is referred to as evidence-based funding. This funding increases the state budget for school funding by $350 million a year, with the goal of reaching 90% adequacy in all school districts by the year of 2027. But let me make one very important point. This number still falls short of the Illinois State Board of Education's analysis that indicates that in order to reach the goal, the formula would need to increase funding by $660 million a year. In closing, as it relates to my opening remarks, we want you to recognize that our goal is to ensure racial equality. It is, however, important to recognize that to fully address the impacts of racism, it is important to address all aspects of racial inequality. And many of us are aware that much of the equity work across our schools are focused on individuals. However, the members of this distinguished panelist also embrace any and all efforts to shift that focus to institutional and structural forms of racism as well. Again, thank you so very much for giving of your gift of time. We look forward to digging really deep into the topics that we have prepared for you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitaker, for that poignant story and for your inspiring words. I am going to introduce myself and have the pleasure of introducing our other panelists tonight. My name is Beatriz Pollack. I'm the Senior Counsel for the Education Equity Team of Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. We are civil rights attorneys and advocates working to secure racial equity and economic opportunity for all. In my work facilitating our Education Equity Team, we seek to protect and promote access to education by addressing the individual and systemic barriers that disproportionately impact students from historically marginalized communities, just as Dr. Whitaker was referencing the need for maintaining clear focus and clear lens on those students whose lived experiences have not been reflected in our systems and not been nurtured. Tonight, I'm also honored to introduce my colleagues, Ana Mercado and Greg Michi. I will be introducing them again momentarily, But first, I'd like to just say thank you to the Promote Equity Illinois Coalition for convening this important and timely event, and to Rainbow Push for hosting us online tonight. I will now introduce Ana Mercado. Ana is an organizer and collaborator working with youth and educators towards liberatory education. She previously led a team of restorative justice coaches supporting Chicago Public Schools to drastically reduce violence, misconduct, and suspension rates, and also working to interrupt practices that negatively contribute to the school-to-prison nexus. Currently, Ana is the lead youth organizer for the Heal Together campaign of Race Forward. Welcome, Ana. And I'd also like to introduce Greg Michi. Greg is an award-winning public school teacher, a researcher, a teacher educator, and best-selling author. His published works include Holler If You Hear Me, See You When We Get There, and We Don't Need Another Hero, which share his teaching experiences and philosophy, and in which he seeks to center the voices and lived experiences of his students. He currently teaches media literacy for kindergarten through 8th graders, correct, Greg, in Chicago Public Schools, and he is also quite a good follow on Twitter for those of you who enjoy that platform. So welcome tonight, Greg. So for the next half hour or so, we're going to engage in a dialogue examining, as Dr. Whitaker said, the persistent impacts of structural racism in our education system. And we're going to share a little bit about the gains that we see, as well as discuss the ongoing battles that energize us and keep us all engaged in this fundamental work of improving public education and making it responsive to all students' needs. To start off, I think we need to do a little bit of level setting and really delve into what we mean when we talk about systemic racism in schools. And here I'll be echoing some of what Dr. Whitaker shared already, but I hope you'll indulge me because I think that this shared language that we need to have around these issues and clarity around naming issues for what they are is really crucial to the work that we do, and it has echoes in the topics that we'll discuss tonight as well. So when I talk about systemic or structural racism, I'm referring to a system in which public policies, institutional practices, and norms work together in various and intersecting ways to perpetuate inequity among racial groups. In our country, this is a system that has worked to elevate and privilege whiteness and work to disadvantage and oppress those perceived to be other than. To talk about systemic racism is also to acknowledge the role of white supremacy, by which I do not mean to reference just extremist groups based in ignorance or hate, but rather which the dictionary itself, Merriam-Webster, defines as beliefs and systems that collectively enable people to maintain power over people of other races. And to have a conversation around this topic is also to acknowledge the role of the historical legacy of white supremacy culture, which is reflected still in the current realities of disproportionate and systemic harm and violence towards Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and other peoples and communities of color in all aspects of our national life, including health, employment, incarceration, policing, the law, environment, housing, and indeed education. And when I talk about culture, I'm going to perhaps oversimplify it by defining culture as the water that we swim in. I think about it as a goldfish in a bowl surrounded by water. And there's a saying that says the longer you swim in a culture, the more invisible it becomes, just like the water to the goldfish in the bowl. So with all of that in mind, I want to talk about this water that we're swimming in and what we often refer to in the field as school culture and climate, as Dr. Whitaker referenced. So I'll start out by asking you, Ana, and then we'll pass it along. And of course, another thing I just want to say about the conversation tonight is that I hope that it will be an iterative conversation. We certainly I welcome everybody to jump in, but otherwise I'll be happy to call on you, make sure that we hear from everybody's expertise. But the first question I'd like us to think about and address is just to talk from each person's vantage point about how we've each seen, and you in particular, Anna, to begin with, have seen systemic racism manifesting in school culture and climate, and also to think about and share with us what practices you've found effective to begin to address these manifestations.
Thank you. And I'm so grateful to be in this space, getting to speak on this. I'm bringing to the table years of organizing young people on the west side of Chicago. And as a part of that, being in schools, seeing so many dedicated individuals trying to live out that promise of educating young people, and still seeing so many needs go unmet for students. And so one thing that I really want to highlight when we're talking about culture and climate, it's all of the interactions, right from when you get into the school building and you have to pass through a metal detector, to seeing not only security, but armed police officers walking through the halls that, you know, are oftentimes getting involved in behavior from a criminal lens instead of from the lens of, this is adolescent behavior, this is something that we need to have folks learn from. Instead, it's like power over, how do we control? And so it's those kinds of really tangible things that you see as you walk through. You see the way that things are laid out, and is it a welcoming environment, or is it about trying to control as much as possible? Then there's what happens in the passing period. When I would walk into some schools and the gates would close and the doors would close with a hall sweep, where everybody that is late is now going to miss half an hour of class while they dole out suspensions. There's all of these things started having this cumulative effect. It was like what it feels like. And then there's like these very particular interactions where the way that we say the thing creates an environment as well, right? So it's these very small interactions that are laced with a really alienating language, instead of language that brings someone in and opens up their thinking. So I wanted to just give you a spattering of different pieces there, and then really talk about all of that lumped together. For years, we've been talking about it as a school to prison pipeline. So all of the discipline practices and the culture and climate that end up with young people being pushed out of class, pushed out of school. And then we see that with even just one suspension, you're 3 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. There's all this data about how it ends up feeding in this direction that's the opposite of like us graduating and being able to make it. And so wanted to highlight that if that's the way that schooling, particularly because I've been traveling all over Chicago and the suburbs around, looking at being invited to do trainings with educators in very different school environments, and I see a very different school system when it's in Black and Brown communities. And so even within CPS, such a big difference is the two CPSs. And so there's what we see here is that, you know, when young people are already starting off with communities that have been undermined and oppressed for generations, then we put them in schools and then see these behaviors that are really trauma responses being treated like not even just discipline issues, but criminal behavior. It's that kind of thing that's what comes to mind the most for me when I think about the structural racism in culture and climate of a school. That's how all these well-meaning people can keep perpetuating something that keeps it so unequal. That's why we see these disparities be so great. So then what do we do about it? What's the solution? What has worked, right? And so the thing that I keep seeing over and over again is that when we focus on a shift in mindset for the folks in the building, and we're working with everyone. So it's the principal and the disciplinarian and the teachers and the cafeteria workers and the students and the parents, everyone working on a whole mindset shift towards how do we get from a culture of compliance and control to a culture that's about relationship and accountability to each other, like actually understanding how what I do impacts you, and vice versa, right? That we are in this together. And over and over again throughout a school day, there's opportunities to do that. And so there's a lot of training and policy work and new systems and structures that have to get put in place for a school to be able to do that. Because culture shift work is not something that happens overnight. It's not something that you can just, write up in a policy and it's done. Not even something where you can send them to 5 days of training and it's done, right? This is has to be everybody's thing. So when we come in and we're doing culture shift work in schools as practitioners of what we term restorative justice, we're working with folks on all of those pieces and understanding that there's got to be like a strategy. And so when it's put as something that is not just about we will get rid of the suspensions, but what are the interventions that we're going to put in its place that are actually going to address the issues, like these conflicts that we can expect to be a natural part of any community. How are we going to handle those? Anytime there's harm, which is a natural part of any human community, what do we do about those things? And starting to think creatively about those and actually get at the root causes of those. And I've seen young people do an amazing job of this. I want to shout out the peer conference leaders that, even like fifth graders being able to talk with their peers about like, this is the real impact on everybody else. It's not just because they said so, it's because this impacts all of us. And then be able to listen and help to make the connection about like, what do you actually need and how do we all support you? So that the young person isn't just left to their own devices to try to figure out how they're going to turn everything around. The idea behind restorative justice is that when there's a harm, we all come together and we figure out how we're actually going to prevent this from happening in the future. And that requires actually getting underneath there about what it's actually about and getting creative about what it's going to take. So that can sound kind of like a lot, right? Because it's a lot easier to write somebody up and have the the specified consequence already, everything all figured out. But what we find is that the more you can invest in these kinds of practices, both before something happens when you're building a relationship, and then after something happens, how you repair the relationship, it has ripple effects in ways that folks never imagine. And folks, teachers come back to us again and again being like, this is actually making my whole classroom, like this one incident, it was a learning moment for my whole classroom. So I was able to knock this out, not just one by one, but everybody learned from this. And it strengthens you for the next time, each time you're doing it. So it flips it on its head about like what it really is going to take. I'm going to stop there, but so welcome any questions folks have about these things I'm talking about.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. I just want to highlight that there's a couple of questions asking for examples in the chat. So if you have an opportunity to go in there, that'd be great. But I also really just want to share appreciation for what you said about the necessity to build authentic relationships and to start with just a mutual respect with the student and a valuing of the student that they can feel in throughout the building, and that this is the responsibility of everyone in the building, all of the adults. And with that, also turn now to ask Greg, who from his perspective, both in the classroom as an educator of teachers, how have you seen systemic racism at play in the classroom environment itself, and what effective interventions can you share with us?
Thank you, and yes, thank you, as Anna said, for allowing me to be part of this panel. I've been a teacher and teacher educator in Chicago for 30 years, so I've been in a lot of different schools, but my context is mostly Chicago public schools. I would echo what Anna said about the policing and over-policing of Black students, the discipline disparities between white students and Black and Latinx students. I've had plenty of my own students who felt when they went to high school, what I would call pushed out of high school. And what one of them described is, this school feels like it wasn't made for us. And you know, as someone who has stayed in touch with students after they left 8th grade and throughout their high school years and beyond, that's hurtful. And to imagine what would, push a student, lead a student to feel like they have no other choice but to leave the school that is supposed to be for them is upsetting, and it's not new. But in addition to that, a few other things I would mention are, do students see themselves, like their own racial and cultural selves, represented in the school, meaning in the books that are on the shelves, in what's on the walls, and particularly in the faces of their teachers? And I worry about this even more in majority white schools. Are the students who aren't white in those majority white schools seeing themselves represented, feeling seen and heard in those spaces? I also feel like another kind of example of the way systemic racism plays out is how testing impacts many Black and primarily Black and Latino schools in Chicago. I think we would all agree that student learning is one of the most important things that needs to happen in schools. But the focus, sometimes the singular focus on raising test scores causes schools in some neighborhoods, their after school programs are, we're going to have to we want to boost academic achievement. Where in other schools, they have, a photography club and a journalism club and several different kinds of sports teams. All kids deserve that kind of holistic experience in school. All kids deserve to have space to, develop themselves in all the different areas. And I think sometimes that becomes problematic. In terms of how ways we can change, I think there's definitely, policies at the state level and at the district level that need to be changed to help that. But I'll just tell a really quick example of what a small group of people did at our school a couple of years ago. About 6 teachers started an anti-racist, anti-biased reading to action group or study to action group. And we didn't have a clear idea of what the action was going to be when we started, but we read a lot. We met every 2 weeks. We had discussions on what needs to happen in our school. What could we do to create a better climate that embraced all students, that helped us see students. And out of that group came an invitation and a talk from Dr. Gholdy Muhammad, who some of you may know is the author of an outstanding book called Cultivating Genius, which led to some teacher-led PD on how to create more culturally responsive and sustaining curriculum in our school. Also led to a student LGBTQ group starting in the school, and the administration allotting a pretty decent chunk of money for every teacher to buy literature, young adult and children's literature for their classroom that is specifically culturally sustaining and responsive and written by Black, Latinx authors and authors of color. So it's a small example, but I think it's a good example of how, you know, a small group of people can create change, and those things ripple out, or can ripple out.
Thank you so much, Greg, especially for sharing that example of things that are so actionable. And while I certainly agree with you that law and policy need to change, we still have work to do in that vein. It's also the case that a change on paper isn't going to bring about the change that we need to see in classrooms, and certainly not with the urgency that we need it so that we can impact students today. So that's a really great example of how a group of motivated individuals in a community can push progress. Dr. Whitaker, I want to turn it over to you.
Sure, I'll provide a real brief response to this question so that we can advance, but I think that my peers here have done a pretty thorough job. My initial response to this question actually ties to the fact that I have had the great honor of serving as an administrator, not only in school districts serving majority Black students, but I've also served in key and critical positions in school districts serving majority white students, as well as a school district serving majority Latino students. So I think it's only fair to suggest that I view the world as it relates to this topic by many different lenses, having had that many different experiences. But in an interest of being very, very clear and direct relevant to my response, I would suggest that this students have to feel that they are a part of the academic environment. I think that one of the biggest injustices that Black students in particular experience in not just in Illinois schools, but in America's schools, is stepping into an environment when they don't see themselves as a part of it. And a quick example of that is recently I was speaking to a girlfriend of mine, and she shared my daughter was actually promoted to advanced level classes in her school, but she doesn't want to go to school. She doesn't want to be in those classes. And her daughter happened to be an African-American, obviously female. And she shared with her mother, in the classes that I'm in now, there's no other Black girls. I'm the only Black girl in my class. And so, again, I shared earlier related to self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that the biggest contributions to negative race relations that have occurred, regardless of the type of school district that I have served in summary, has been associated with environments that send either a subliminal or unintentional or an intentional message that you don't have a place in academia. And that provides for students a negative experience because they check into the process already checked out of the learning process. What effective interventions? I mentioned it earlier, my favorite term, practicing the policy of intentionality. If we recognize the need for African-American students, brown students, students experiencing the impact of poverty to be represented in classes where they'll have greater academic exposure to higher level content, then we've got to recognize the social and emotional impact that has on them when they're in classes where nobody else actually looks like them in that space.
Thank you so much for uplifting that, Dr. Whitaker. And I want to turn our attention now to not just to the question of what the environment looks like and how students see themselves reflected in the environment, but to the actual content of what is taught. And so we'll talk a little bit about curriculum. And I think in this moment, it's difficult to have a conversation around systemic racism in the times that we live without naming an elephant in the room that I generally don't like to give a lot of airtime to, but we will dispense with quickly. And so I want to ask each of you, each of the distinguished panelists here, about the topic of critical race theory. And I always use my air quotes because we know, well, I won't load the deck before I ask you the question. But given all the vantage points that each of you have interfaced with the educational system with, I just want to ask you, first of all, do any of you have experience with critical race theory being taught in elementary or secondary public schools that you've seen at all?
No.
No.
Anna?
Nope.
And, you know, I have to say the same thing as an education law practitioner, as an elementary school educator, as a public school parent. This is just not something that is taught in our schools. However, as we've all likely heard, you know, it bears repeating again, you know, critical race theory is a concept that has been weaponized by those who would like to push back on culturally responsive teaching and learning practices and on the progress that has been made around the conversation of having an honest accounting of the historical realities of especially Black students and families in America, but really all non-white families and students in America. Critical race theory is a theoretical tool that began in law schools in an attempt to explain persistent inequity, and it's a tool that has served that function as well in graduate level studies in other academic disciplines, including in graduate level studies in education. However, the reality supported by our experiences and much literature on this topic is that critical race theory is not a theory or curriculum taught in elementary or secondary public schools. However, that hasn't stopped a recent avalanche of legislation around the country that has been positioned as preventing the teaching of CRT in public schools. Recent reporting suggests that in 2022, 36 states so far have introduced 137 bills seeking to restrict instruction in elementary, secondary schools, and in teacher education programs on topics of race, gender, sexuality, and US history. And this is actually a 250% increase from 2021, when 22 states introduced 54 bills attempting to restrict instruction and curriculum. And as we know, unfortunately, there's been some success in those efforts. So really, I want to ask each of you to what you attribute this avalanche of legislation, this persistence of this topic in our discourse, and at the same time shift into asking you how you've actually seen classroom curriculum change, or how you think it still needs to change. And I'll start with you, Greg.
I think the first thing I'd like to, I guess, raise up is this is not new. This iteration with anti-CRT crowds is new, but attempts to suppress the real teaching of history have been going on for a long time. There's a great anecdote in a book called Fugitive Pedagogy by Jarvis Givens, and he tells a story of a Black teacher in Louisiana in the 1930s who had a required curriculum to teach, and her white supervisors would come around once a week, once every 2 weeks, and come in to be sure she was teaching out of this prescribed curriculum. But what she did was she was actually teaching out of a book by Carter G. Woodson, and she would have that book out to teach her Black students, and when the supervisor administrator come around, she'd put that book in the desk and get the prescribed curriculum out. So there have been efforts to suppress the teaching of real history, true history. And also you can go to West Virginia in the 70s, in Arizona in the early 2010s, there was the fight over Mexican-American studies that the political leaders in Arizona we're trying to suppress. So this has been going on for a long time. But I think it's important to name that in all these cases, or virtually all these cases, I would say all, it's white lawmakers and white parents who are pushing to limit the curriculum, to ban books, to make it illegal now to even mention certain ideas around racial justice or around the history of racially oppressed groups. And sometimes white people like to say, well, this is historical amnesia, but it's not about losing collective memory. This is intentional historical denial and erasure. That's what's happening right now. And I think to some degree, it's pushback on some gains that have been made. It's not enough, but when I look at the young adult novels and picture books for young children that are available now compared to 10, 15 years ago, there are far more books by authors of color, far more books that have Black, Latinx, Native, Asian protagonists. And I think it's fear among many white people in America that the country that they think once was, which I think never really was, the way that they're imagining it, is changing. And this fear is causing a backlash. And just one more thing I'd like to mention, though, there are good things happening. And some of them are in Chicago public schools. There's some great curriculum recently that has come out of the CPS, Department of Social Science and Civic Engagement. There's a Reparations 1 curriculum that is outstanding. There is a Participate Civics curriculum for middle school and high school that's really good. And also there's a group in Chicago called Asian Americans Advancing Justice that's done some great work supporting the new law that says all Chicago elementary and high schools have to teach some unit on Asian American history, Asian American studies. So despite the climate and what's in the news, and that's real and important to pay attention to, I do think there's some good things happening related to curriculum.
Thanks so much, Greg. And Dr. Whitaker, would you like to join?
Sure, I'd like to concur with everything that Greg just said, and then add that while he was talking, the following came to my mind, and it's the phrase, I cannot be what I cannot see. And the reality is, as has been stated, if children are reporting to school every single day, and they have limited images of people that look like them doing amazing things, it makes it very, very difficult for them to believe that they can actually achieve. Now, obviously, the goal here is not to just identify the problems, right? Not to admire the problems, but to then also add value as it relates to what to do about it. And so to add value to what Greg stated already, which I also concur with, and that there are some amazing steps taken that I've been able to observe. I'm not a part of Chicago Public Schools. My school district's in the south suburbs of Illinois, but I've watched very closely and concur with him that good things are happening. I want to take that a step further and just suggest that under my leadership in the school district where I serve in a senior leadership capacity, what we've actually done is change the way we select curriculum. And it's so interesting because when I say this on the next statement that I'm going to make on a national stage, textbook company heads call me when I say, especially to Board of Education members, hey, guess what? You've got buying power. You've got a lot of power. And so even though there is a nationwide attempt to deny Black children in particular access to information about their history, the reality is that we all serve in key and critical positions, and we have the ability to determine what curriculums we put in front of them. And so in my district in particular, what we did was we actually developed our own scoring rubric. There is none like it in the country. And this scoring rubric we use to evaluate literacy curriculums. In our systems, my teachers decided that they wanted to move forward with supporting me and preparing to make a recommendation to the Board of Education as to the type of literacy curriculum our students would be exposed to. This scoring rubric was based on research that shared with us what Black students needed to know and learn about their history. And so when textbook companies came in, and I know the heads of a lot of them, but when they came in and did their amazing presentations about the content, if they presented to us books with pictures of animals, more pictures of animals in them than they had of beautiful Black folks, we walked them right on out the door. By the time we got done with our curriculum selection process, textbook companies had been called from all over the country. If you go to Sonja Whitaker School District, she's got a rubric that her staff has developed, and they're expecting for you to present to them proposed curriculum that reflects the spirits and the lives of children of Black culture in a positive light. And that was our benchmark. That was the benchmark for how we selected our reading curriculum. It has also been the benchmark for which we selected our math curriculum as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitaker. I can't wait to continue this conversation with you and take a look at that rubric. I hope you'll share.
It's powerful.
Anna, I'll give you the last word on this topic.
So the Heal Together campaign, the Heal Together campaign started because we were seeing that this backlash that you're talking about, Greg, has gotten to this fever pitch. Really, it's something that we've been analyzing and seeing that it is a manufactured a problem, right? And so it's something that folks like Chris Rufo have explicitly said that they were going to use and as part of the strategy. And we are clear that this is nothing short of a massive pushback after all of the advancement that's happened, where like 26 million people coming out in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. In 2020 alone, the mention of racial equity and structural racism in the media was more than in many years combined before that. And so this is part of what we see again and again in movement as a natural, this is a backlash to all of that work that's been happening. And you speak about the reparations one here, right here in Chicago, where that's one of the many pieces of that, right? Where we start to see any kind of advancement in this. And then there's all of this trying to get us to take it back 100 more years. And so what we are seeing is that there's all this dark money that's going into very local school district campaigns. There's this 1-2 punch of like trying to go after public education structurally, but then also in terms of the culture wars. And ultimately, we see this as an attack on the very promise of what public education could be for this country. So if we are ever to realize any kind of dream of a just multiracial society, not just for some, but where we actually figure out how to live together and do this thing together, education and schools in particular are a key location where that would happen. I saw in the chat that there were folks commenting a little bit about like that role that we could be playing. And because it's a place where people could learn about each other and where we need folks to be able to learn the basic foundational skills to be able to share power together and live together in one society, right? So how are we going to do that? So it's very intentional that they're coming after some of the most basic institutions as part of this bigger backlash. And so we see this as something that is relevant then for every one of us. So even if you don't have a young person in school or you're not a student, that this is a foundational kind of attack. Like whether we how we understand the very foundation of everything. So we've also, I just want to highlight that we've seen that there have been reasons to hope that when folks actually have fought back on these manufactured culture wars, they've actually been able to push back from some of these folks winning the seat on the school board, and not the books not being banned. Like there's groups of students all over the country that have fought back and been able to roll some of those worst policies back. And so it is also a moment of opportunity for folks that have not previously been engaged in education as an issue to be able to come on in and actually make a difference here. This is education justice is something that folks have been fighting for a very long time. Obviously, this is a moment where it's waking folks up in a new way too. So the Heal Together campaign is trying to give that support for folks doing that work locally, because folks get overwhelmed sometimes by like all of the stuff coming at them, right? And so being able to have support to think through a strategy, how are we going to bring folks in and have voices heard that may be shouted down by all these folks that are whipped up at meetings claiming to represent parents and students. Really, what we keep finding over and over again is that the majority is actually for public education, is actually with us when it comes to trying to have the progress and learning that we've been fighting for all along. And so it's about lifting up that majority.
Thank you for sharing that, and then for reflecting and reminding us of the collective power of community to engage in this and push back. And just one, we're running low on time, but we do want to touch on our third issue briefly here, which is a large issue, as all of these have been. We could have had a full discussion around any one of these topics, but I do want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the fact that all of this progress, all of this positive work that we're talking about tonight requires resources. And resource in our education systems come through funding structures that are similarly impacted by structural racism. As Dr. Whitaker indicated in her comments, in Illinois, we have seen progress in that there has been the implementation of an evidence-based funding formula, which actually is designed to send more resources to the most under-resourced student and is grounded in research-based adequacy target calculations for districts statewide. The formula, however, was targeted to be fully funded by 2027, and as Dr. Whitaker already acknowledged, by current calculations, some set that full funding target date now to 2047, and others, including coalition folks who I work with, who are calling for 100% funding, not 90% funding of that formula, indicate that at the pace of minimum increased funding of $300 million, the $300 million that Dr. Whitaker referenced, we will not see this progressive evidence-based funding formula meant to deliver an adequate education to all Illinois students fully funded until 2054. So needless to say, work needs to be done. And I just wanted to ask in these closing moments, each of our panelists, if you would please reflect on the realities of these funding disparities and focus also, if you would please, on what in fact could school systems do if they were adequately resourced? What do we need this additional money for? Because it's important to not just call for better money, but for more money, but more money better spent in service of students and educators. I'll start with you, Dr. Whitaker.
Let me tell you, I'm like totally dying to answer this question. because I started out really, and I'll be brief, but factual. I'm going to speak from my practical experience. You all, I spent the greater majority of my administrative career working in more affluent school districts serving majority white students. I decided to take on my first superintendency in a district where 100% of the students were Black and 100% of the students qualified for free and reduced lunch. So like literally overnight, I went from serving in one of the most affluent school districts in the state of Illinois to one of the poorest school districts, poor in terms of our students' access to financial resources, let me be clear, but very, very rich in terms of their intellectual potential. For me professionally, that happened overnight. On the other side of town where I served, we were giving Black leather book bags and wireless laptop Apple computers. I took my new job as superintendent of schools and I walked on the property, and the first thing that I noticed, you all, in the same state in the 21st century, my students didn't even have a playground. I'm not talking about a playground because far too many communities of color don't even have a YMCA. That's another story. I'm talking about the school didn't have a playground. Not only did we not have a playground, but my students walked to school in the street because they didn't even have a sidewalk. Imagine this if it could get any worse. Imagine being a first-year superintendent, standing in front of your staff, and after going through the financials that were managed for that district, you had to report to the Board of Education and the teaching staff that you didn't have enough money in the district's bank account to make payroll. After having left working in a district for 10 years that had at least 9 months cash in the district. Oh, I can go on about what this looks like, and not only just from the access and the exposure to students. I'm not talking about an Olympic-sized pool. I got to just say this one more time. I'm just talking about a playground. And so I think to move toward recommended solutions from a policy perspective, we've got to be clear and then develop policies around what equity in education looks like as it relates to the distribution of funds. Regardless of what the funding formula actually looks like from state to state within our nation, what do we expect every student in our beautiful America, the United States of America, minimally, what do we expect all students be able to have exposure to as a direct result of their public education experience would be my recommendation. Again, to be clear about that, to develop policies around that, and then to ensure implementation fidelity as it relates to the implementation of the policies that I would suggest.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitaker. In the interest of time, I'm going to leave the funding discussion there because I do want the panelists to have an opportunity to give us even a 1 or 2 minute recommendation, whether it be on funding, whether it be on any of the topics that we discussed or other topics that you feel strongly about from your practice, about how parents, students, and interested communities can mobilize toward a more equitable education system. And I'll start with you, Greg.
Thanks. So really quickly, in terms of something specific, I would say a lot of these things can feel overwhelming and beyond what one person or a few people can do. But I would suggest to parents the same thing that we tried to do in my teacher group at my school. Start small, start with a group of motivated people, a reading group or a discussion group. But the important part is discussion to action or reading to action, that the goal of it is to do something that's going to bring about change in the area of racial justice, representation, whatever it looks like in your school or your district. The action part is key because study is important, and reading and making ourselves more aware of issues is great, but that in itself does not create change. And then the other thing I'd just like to add to that is just speaking directly to white parents and white teachers too, is I think we need to avoid complacency. We need to avoid thinking that, oh, well, we see these articles or see on the internet things that are happening in Texas or Florida. Oh, that's not happening here. Well, just because that's not happening here doesn't mean we're doing everything we need to do to validate and make sure that every student, Black students, brown students, every student who comes to our doors is feeling like an embraced full member of the school community. One of the things that I really don't like hearing from teachers, and I hear it sometimes, is when there's a new initiative, even if it's a good one proposed, they may say, oh, we're already doing that. But a lot of times we really aren't already doing that. We might be doing some things, but the question we need to ask, I think, is what more can we do? What more can we do? And to paraphrase John Dewey, I think we have to have the attitude that what we want for our own children, we want for all the community's children.
Thank you so much, Greg. Dr. Whitaker?
Yeah, I'm sitting here, I was gonna use a little fancy term like advocate, but I think I want to say it like I really want to say it. We got to make some noise. We got to make some noise. I think that parents are doing a really good job, community members, of stating their interests, but I think that we could all do an even better job. There are far too many instances in which we know that children are attending schools that are inadequately funded, and children are attending schools with materials that don't reflect their spirits, their interests, and their intellectual potential. And we're too quiet about it. And so I'll conclude while saying how important it is to make some noise and to show up at board meetings and to ask questions like, does the district have a strategic plan that with a focus on leveling the playing field for all students by addressing equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion within their not just stated plan, within their written plan, so that you can not only support the school district, but also hold them accountable for what they say they're going to do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitaker. And Anna?
I love those answers, and I want to really hammer home that this isn't going to happen if we aren't working together. And so an organizing approach, it starts with being able to listen to the folks that are, around you, that maybe are even beyond the choir, right? Of the folks that are always at the school board meetings, right? So reaching out and getting a committee together is going to be key, so that as you, whatever form of making noise that you're going to do, give them hell. It's really going to be that it's something that you're doing together, and that you're finding ways to bring more and more people in. And so one of the initiatives we've been doing is inviting people in to just start by listening and do a listening project. Put surveys out there, do events where people are actually getting to come and share what they see are the big needs in the community, in the school, because that's a great way to find other like-minded people that you can say, hey, let's do this together. But also that when you show up to the school board meeting, you're not just speaking for the three of us anymore. You're speaking for that, we believe that this is what we need to be talking about. Like like we have gigantic class sizes, and you're over here talking about some lies that aren't even happening in school. Like, talk about the things that we actually need. So if you are interested in actually taking action and like not just as a lone wolf, but like really getting involved with others on this, we are also poised to help you, to like walk alongside you as you're trying to figure this thing out, and how are we going to make this thing happen, and who else is out there that you can simply fill out an interest form and be able to talk to an organizer and get the ball rolling about, like, how do I actually tangibly see this to the finish line, right? So beyond just one action where, you know, you maybe got some good attention, but actually till you get all the way to the change that you want to see. So that's what we do as organizers, and there's all kinds of resources and supports for connecting you up, because you are also not just isolated wherever you are in Illinois. Like really, there's folks all across the country that are finding ways to push back on this. Really creative stuff happening from like young people in Georgia, the Michigan, parents, folks out in Texas. There's a lot of great stuff to get connected to. So just reach out and we'll connect you up.
Thank you so much, Anna. I just want to say thank you again to all of my fellow speakers tonight for this tremendous education. I appreciate your candor and I appreciate your expressions of hope. And I look forward to some future collaboration and to working together to make that noise. And with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Cassie Cresswell. Cassie is the Director and President of Illinois Families for Public Schools, a grassroots organization seeking to center and amplify the voices of pro-public school parents in policy and legislative advocacy at the state level. Thank you, Cassie.
Hi, so I'm Cassie. We've covered a lot of what I'd like to share with you guys. So I'm really just wanting to let you know about tools and resources, including some of the things that have been mentioned during the discussion and brought up in the chat as well. And so we put together basically a really starter resource guide, and I'll put the link for it in the chat. And let me share my screen and show it to you as well. But really, I think the thing to highlight on it is that it has a bunch of the things that we talked about this evening, and especially some concrete action steps you can take, including on state funding. And it has a link to find your state legislators and really ask them to commit to fully funding the evidence-based funding formula, like has come up several times this evening, and some additional really basic action steps around supporting affordable housing, and also getting involved with your local school board. School board elections are coming up for almost all of Illinois, except for Chicago Public Schools this spring, and supporting candidates who are working towards racially just public schools is really important, or running as a candidate yourself. This resource guide also has a whole bunch of questions to ask, like Dr. Whitaker was saying, things that you should be bringing up, and to ask, are the policies and the practices at the classroom level, the school level, the district level, supporting racial justice? Are they reinforcing systemic racism, or are they helping disrupt it? So we have a bunch of suggested questions that can kind of lead you to looking at what's really happening on the ground. We have a lot of keep learning resources to read about things like culturally relevant pedagogy, and different resources on segregated schools, looking to see how much segregation is happening even within the district or within schools. And then really, I think the thing that Anna mentioned a bunch, and we really want to emphasize, is that it's so important to connect with other people, not just in your own community, but really looking for expertise. That there's so many local and state and national orgs that have been working in this area for a long time. And whether you are new to this fight or you're a more seasoned veteran, there's a ton of things happening. And especially here at the end of the toolkit, we have the links to connect to Heal Together. So that, I think, is really important if you really want an actual human to help you with getting organized in your own school community and in your own local community. That's a thing where you can fill out a form and get connected to organizing support and advice. And also the Heal Together kit is there as well. And I also have the email for our org. We work in a bunch of different public school advocacy issue areas, including funding and also things like standardized testing and student data privacy, and pushing back against privatization of our public schools. So we can help you find others in your community who are also working on these issues. So you can reach out by email. And for a lot of the stuff, we're going to send out this link to this particular document, and also some of the links that were mentioned in the chat as well. So look for that in your email within the next couple of days if you're registered for this event. So I will turn it back to Jan Schwartz to wrap up. And thank you everyone for being here tonight.
Hey, everybody. I am just overwhelmed by how meaningful tonight's discussion was. And I hope it's the beginning of many more conversations and discussions and program on this very important subject, because to not take action allows us to be threatened by going so backwards in the education for all rather than forward for all students. And if everyone isn't safe in school, then nobody is really safe. And I so appreciate the expertise of this panel and what they brought forward to help us better understand all the critical issues that we are up against and some solutions if we all get together and work together. I want to especially thank our panel, Dr. Whitaker, Beatriz, Diaz, Pollack, Anna, Mercado, Greg Michi, and Cassie Caswell. I want to thank our coalition members, our co-sponsors, and I want to thank Rainbow Push and especially Rose Glenn, our IT specialist who made tonight possible. Most of all, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, and thank you for being a participant. Okay, good night, everybody.